A body was found in an alley. 3 bullets. Execution style. The detective knew who did it within 24 hours. He had witnesses. He had motive. He had evidence. Everything pointed to one name: Al Capone. But then something strange happened. Witnesses started forgetting what they saw. Evidence disappeared from the police station. Files went missing. The detective's captain told him to focus on other cases. Within a month, the detective requested reassignment. Not because he gave up. Because he was told to. The case stayed open, technically. But nobody worked on it. Nobody asked questions. Nobody pushed for answers. 40 years later, the file still sits in a warehouse, unsolved. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone knows who gave the order. Everyone knows why it was never prosecuted. But knowing isn't the same as proving, and proving requires a system willing to act. This system wasn't willing. This is the story of a murder that was solved on day 1 and remains unsolved. Forever. The case where all the evidence pointed in one direction, but justice couldn't follow. Not because the truth was hidden. Because the truth didn't matter. The body was discovered at dawn. A delivery man found it behind a row of trash cans. He'd been cutting through the alley on his way to work. He saw the shoes first. Expensive shoes. Still shined despite the dirt of the alley. Then he saw the rest. He ran to find a phone. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 patrol officers initially, then detectives, then more detectives. They cordoned off the alley. They photographed everything. The body, the position, the surrounding area. The victim was male, mid-30s, well-dressed. 3 bullet wounds, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. No weapon at the scene, no shell casings. The killer had been careful. The victim's identification was in his wallet. His name was Joseph Aiello. He ran a bakery on the west side. Successful business, no criminal record. But everyone in the neighborhood knew something else about him. He'd been trying to expand, to push into territory that wasn't his, to challenge certain arrangements that had been in place for years. The lead detective was a man named William O'Brien, 15 years on the force. Good reputation, fair, thorough. He stood in the alley looking at the body. He knew what this was. He knew what it meant. He knew where it would lead. And he knew how it would end. But he started the investigation anyway. The first interviews happened that same day. O'Brien and his partner went to the bakery. They spoke to employees, to family members, to neighbors. Everyone was cooperative. Too cooperative. They all told the same basic story. Joseph Aiello was a good man, hard-working, honest, no enemies. When O'Brien asked about business disputes, people suddenly remembered appointments, deliveries they needed to make, relatives they needed to check on. The bakery itself was clean, well-maintained, profitable by all appearances. But when O'Brien looked at the books, certain numbers didn't make sense. Income that seemed too high for the neighborhood, expenses that seemed inflated. Someone was using the bakery for something other than bread. O'Brien asked about suppliers, about distributors, about who else Aiello did business with. The answers got vague. People started forgetting things. Names they'd remembered clearly 5 minutes earlier suddenly escaped them. O'Brien pushed harder. That evening, he received a phone call at home. No one spoke. Just silence. Then a click. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. The ballistics report came back within 48 hours. The bullets were .38 caliber, common, impossible to trace without the weapon. The angle of entry suggested the shooter was standing close. Very close, within 3 feet, which meant the victim knew his killer, or at least didn't see him as a threat until it was too late. O'Brien requested records of anyone who'd purchased a .38 caliber weapon in the past 6 months. The request was denied. Too broad, too many names. He narrowed the request. Just the South Side, just the past 3 months. Still denied. Someone higher up the chain was blocking him. He didn't know who. The orders came through paperwork, memos, official channels that gave no explanation. Meanwhile, O'Brien continued interviewing people. He spoke to a bartender who worked 3 blocks from where the body was found. The bartender remembered seeing Aiello 2 nights before the murder. Aiello had been drinking, heavily, talking loudly about expansion, about opportunities, about how certain people didn't own the city no matter what they thought. The bartender remembered other men in the bar that night, men who sat quietly in the corner, who listened to everything Aiello said. When O'Brien asked for descriptions, the bartender got nervous. He said he didn't remember clearly. It had been busy. Lots of people coming and going. O'Brien pressed. The bartender said he needed to close up. Come back another time. O'Brien returned 2 days later. The bartender had quit. Left the city. No forwarding address. Weeks passed. O'Brien compiled a list of witnesses. People who might have seen something, heard something, known something. The list had 23 names. He started working through it systematically. The first 5 people he contacted had moved. Suddenly, without notice to landlords or employers. The next 3 claimed they'd never been in that neighborhood, despite evidence showing they worked there, lived there, spent every day there. The following 4 refused to speak to him at all. They closed doors in his face, hung up phones, walked away when they saw him coming. By the time he reached the bottom of the list, he had 3 useful interviews. 3 people willing to say they'd seen Aiello in the days before his death. That he'd been nervous, looking over his shoulder, acting like someone who knew he'd made a mistake. But none of them saw the actual killing. None of them could name names. None of them were willing to testify to anything under oath. O'Brien wrote his reports carefully. He documented everything. Every lead, every dead end, every witness who disappeared. He submitted the reports through proper channels. They went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. Nothing happened. 3 months after the murder, O'Brien received new information, an anonymous tip, a phone call to the precinct, a man's voice, muffled, speaking quickly. The caller said he'd been in the alley that night. He'd seen 3 men. He'd seen the shooting. He described the scene in detail. Details that matched the evidence. Details only someone who was there would know. Then he said one name. Al Capone. Not as the shooter. Capone wasn't in the alley, but as the person who ordered it. The person behind it. Everyone knew it, the caller said. Everyone in the neighborhood. It was an open secret. Aiello had pushed too far, had ignored warnings, had made himself a problem that needed solving. O'Brien asked for the caller's name. The line went dead. O'Brien tried to trace the call. The phone company said it came from a public booth on the north side. By the time officers arrived there, it was empty. O'Brien added the information to his file. He wrote up the anonymous tip. He included everything. He submitted it to his captain. The captain called him into the office the next day. The conversation was brief. The captain said the department appreciated O'Brien's thorough work. But anonymous tips weren't evidence. They couldn't build a case on whispers and rumors. O'Brien said this wasn't rumor. This was confirmation of what the evidence already suggested. The captain said the evidence was circumstantial at best. O'Brien said he could get more. He could dig deeper. He could... The captain interrupted. He said O'Brien had other cases. Active cases. Cases with actual leads and cooperative witnesses. Maybe it was time to prioritize those. O'Brien understood what wasn't being said. He went back to his desk. He opened the Aiello file. He added a note about the conversation with the captain. Then he closed the file. He didn't throw it away. He didn't destroy anything. He kept every piece of evidence, every report, every witness statement. But he stopped actively investigating because he'd been told to. 6 months later, another body was found. Different neighborhood, different circumstances, but similar execution. O'Brien wasn't assigned to that case. A different detective took it. Someone younger, someone eager. O'Brien watched from a distance as the new detective made the same discoveries, followed the same leads, hit the same walls. The young detective came to O'Brien one day, asked for advice. Said he kept hearing one name but couldn't get anyone to say it officially. O'Brien asked what name. The young detective hesitated. Then he said it. Al Capone. O'Brien pulled out the Aiello file. He showed the young detective everything. The evidence, the witness statements, the anonymous tip, the pattern. The young detective asked why nothing had been done. O'Brien didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, because doing something requires more than evidence. It requires people willing to testify, judges willing to hear cases, prosecutors willing to file charges, and none of those things exist when the person you're investigating controls half the city. The young detective said that was wrong, that was corruption, that was... O'Brien agreed. It was all of those things. But that didn't change the reality. The young detective said he wouldn't give up. He'd find a way. He'd build a case so strong nobody could ignore it. O'Brien said nothing. 3 months later, the young detective requested reassignment. His case went into a file. The file went into a cabinet, next to the Aiello file. Years passed. The Aiello case remained officially open. Unsolved, technically active. But nobody worked on it. New detectives came to the precinct. They'd hear about the case. Sometimes they'd pull the file. They'd read through it. They'd see the evidence, the patterns, the connections. They'd ask questions. Senior detectives would explain the situation, not directly, not explicitly, but through stories, through examples, through cases that had gone nowhere despite strong evidence. The new detectives would understand. They'd put the file back, and the case would sit. O'Brien retired after 25 years on the force. At his retirement party, someone asked him about his regrets, about cases he wished he'd solved. He mentioned Joseph Aiello immediately. Everyone at the party went quiet. Someone asked if he'd ever gotten close. O'Brien said he'd gotten close on the first day. He'd known who was responsible. He'd known why it happened. He'd known everything except how to prove it in a way that wouldn't get him killed or fired or disappeared. Someone asked if he'd ever approached Capone directly. O'Brien laughed, a bitter sound. He said he'd never even been in the same room as Capone. Never spoke to him. Never interviewed anyone in his organization. Because the case never got that far. It died long before it could reach that level. Another detective asked if anyone else had tried. O'Brien said a few people had, over the years. Different cases, different victims. But the same pattern. Evidence that pointed clearly, witnesses who vanished, files that stalled. The party moved on to other topics. But later that night, O'Brien went home and pulled out his personal copy of the Aiello file. He'd kept duplicates of everything, against regulations, but he'd done it anyway. He looked through the photos, the reports, the witness statements. He knew exactly what happened. He knew who gave the order. He knew who pulled the trigger. He knew everything, but knowing wasn't enough. It had never been enough. 5 years after O'Brien's retirement, a newspaper reporter decided to write a retrospective piece on unsolved murders in Chicago. The Aiello case was on his list. He requested the file from the police department. After several weeks and multiple follow-up requests, he received a heavily redacted version. Most names were blacked out. Most addresses were removed. Entire pages were missing. What remained was barely comprehensible. A skeleton of a case with no connective tissue. The reporter tried to fill in the gaps. He tracked down old witnesses. Most were dead. A few had moved out of state. One agreed to speak, but only off the record. That witness confirmed what the reporter already suspected. Everyone knew who killed Joseph Aiello. Everyone had always known, but saying it out loud was dangerous. Even years later, even after Capone was gone. Because the organization hadn't disappeared. The power structure had shifted but not collapsed, and there were still people who remembered, who enforced old codes, who made sure certain stories stayed quiet. The reporter asked why nobody had ever come forward, why nobody had testified. The witness said people had come forward, in private, in whispers, in conversations that couldn't be recorded or used in court. But official testimony, on the record, that required a level of courage most people didn't have. Because testifying meant painting a target on yourself, on your family, on everyone you cared about. And for what? So a case could go to trial, so lawyers could argue, so a jury that might be compromised could reach a verdict that might not stick. The risk wasn't worth the reward. The reporter finished his research. He wrote his article. His editor read it and called him into the office. The editor said the piece was well written, thoroughly researched, compelling, but it made serious allegations about a major historical figure without definitive proof. The reporter said the proof was in the pattern, in the consistency of witness accounts, in the systematic destruction of evidence. The editor said that wasn't the same as hard evidence. That wasn't the same as documentation. The reporter said documentation existed. It had just been buried, redacted, lost. The editor said exactly. So they couldn't publish accusations based on documentation that no longer existed. The article was killed. The reporter kept his notes. He thought maybe someday he'd write a book, expand the research, find the evidence that had been hidden. He never did. The notes sat in a box in his basement. Years later, his daughter found them while cleaning out the house after his death. She read through them. She was horrified by what she learned. She asked her mother if her father had ever published this story. Her mother said no. It had been too dangerous. Even then. The daughter asked if it was still dangerous now. Her mother said some things stay dangerous. Some stories carry weight no matter how much time passes. The daughter wanted to pursue it, to finish what her father had started. Her mother asked her not to, so she didn't. The notes went back in the box. The box went back in the basement. The Aiello case file still exists. It's stored in a warehouse where old police records are kept. Row after row of filing cabinets, decades of cases, most forgotten. The file is marked as open, unsolved, active. But nobody has looked at it in 20 years. Nobody will look at it again, because everyone who was involved is dead. Everyone who witnessed anything is gone. Everyone who could testify has either disappeared or decided the risk wasn't worth it. The case exists in a strange limbo. Not closed because that would require admitting failure. Not pursued because pursuit is pointless. It just sits there. A reminder of what happens when power becomes too big to challenge. When fear becomes more effective than evidence. When everyone knows the truth, but nobody can say it. There are other cases like this. Dozens of them. Files that connect to the same name, the same organization, the same methods. Some are older than the Aiello case. Some are newer. All of them follow the same pattern. Clear evidence, obvious suspects, investigations that stall, witnesses who disappear, files that go nowhere. Detectives who worked on these cases talk about them sometimes, quietly, in private. When they're sure nobody's listening, they talk about the frustration, about knowing exactly what happened but being unable to prove it in any meaningful way. They talk about the politics, about the pressure from above, about the unspoken understanding that certain cases weren't supposed to be solved. They talk about the victims, about the families who deserved answers and never got them, about justice that was supposed to be blind but somehow couldn't see the most obvious crimes. Some of these detectives tried to push through, to fight the system, to build cases despite the obstacles. Most of them didn't last long. They were reassigned, demoted, encouraged to retire early. A few kept going, kept investigating in their spare time, kept collecting evidence that would never be used. They died with boxes full of files, cases they'd never solved, answers they'd never been allowed to provide. Their families didn't know what to do with the boxes, didn't understand the significance, didn't realize they were holding evidence of systemic failure. Most of those boxes were thrown away, lost to time, forgotten. A few survived, sitting in attics and basements, gathering dust. Maybe someday someone will find them, will read through them, will understand what they represent. But probably not, because the cases they document are old now. The people involved are dead. The crimes happened so long ago that they feel more like history than tragedy, and history doesn't demand justice the way tragedy does. Now Joseph Aiello's family left Chicago. They moved within a year of his death. They sold the bakery. They disappeared into other cities, other lives. Nobody blamed them. They'd asked for answers and received silence. They'd asked for justice and received paperwork. They'd asked for something to make sense and received nothing. So they left. Because staying meant living with the constant reminder that power trumps truth. That fear is more effective than law, that sometimes the only answer you get is silence. His children grew up knowing their father was murdered. But they didn't know the details. Their mother wouldn't tell them, said it was too dangerous even to know. When they were adults, some of them tried to find out. They made inquiries. They contacted the police department. They requested the file. They received a heavily redacted version, names removed, details obscured, anything meaningful stripped away. One of his sons became a lawyer. He thought maybe he could use his position to investigate, to find out what really happened, to get answers his family deserved. He made it 3 months before someone suggested he stop. The suggestion came through a colleague. Over lunch. Casual conversation that turned serious. The colleague said it would be a shame if Aiello's son pursued this. Said there were still people who remembered, who took these things seriously, who would view investigation as provocation. The colleague said he was passing along a message, not a threat, just a friendly warning. Aiello's son understood. He stopped investigating. He never told his siblings why, just said he'd hit dead ends, that too much time had passed, that there was nothing to find. They believed him, because what else could they do? Al Capone was never charged in connection with Joseph Aiello's murder. He was never questioned about it, never brought in for an interview, never mentioned in official documentation. His name appears nowhere in the case file. But everyone knew, the reporters knew. They wrote around it, used phrases like organized crime and underworld connections without naming names. Police knew. They documented evidence that pointed in his direction, but never followed those leads to their conclusion. The public knew. They talked about it in bars and restaurants, whispered about it in neighborhoods, understood that certain deaths had certain causes. But knowing didn't matter. Because knowing without proof is just suspicion, and suspicion without testimony is just gossip. The system required more than knowledge. It required evidence that could survive scrutiny, witnesses who would testify under oath, documentation that couldn't be disputed, and none of those things existed. Or when they did exist, they disappeared. Files went missing from the police station. Evidence was lost during transfers, witnesses moved away or changed their stories or simply refused to cooperate. The case couldn't move forward because every time it tried to, something stopped it. Not obviously, not violently, just quietly, systematically, efficiently, a bureaucratic wall that looked like normal procedure but functioned as protection. Decades later, historians tried to piece together what really happened. They collected oral histories. They interviewed people who'd been alive during that era. They examined what little documentation remained. They reached the same conclusion everyone had reached at the time. Al Capone ordered the hit. Joseph Aiello died because he challenged power that couldn't be challenged. The case was never solved because solving it would have required confronting that power directly. The historians documented this. They wrote books. They gave lectures. They presented evidence. And nobody was surprised. Because this wasn't new information. This wasn't a revelation. This was confirmation of what everyone had always known. The only difference was that now it could be said openly. Now that everyone involved was dead. Now that the power structure had changed. Now that it was history instead of current events. But saying it openly didn't change what happened. Didn't bring justice to Joseph Aiello or his family. Didn't solve the case in any meaningful way. It just acknowledged what had always been true. That some crimes go unpunished, that some criminals are too powerful to prosecute, that sometimes the system fails deliberately rather than accidentally. The case remains open. Technically, in the sense that no one has ever officially closed it. No one has ever written "case closed" on the file folder and moved it to inactive status. It sits in that warehouse, among thousands of other unsolved cases, a testament to questions that were never answered, justice that was never served, a system that failed and everyone knew it. Sometimes researchers request access to old case files. They're studying crime patterns or police procedures or some other academic topic. Occasionally, someone pulls the Aiello file. They read through the redacted documents. They note the missing pieces, the obvious gaps, the leads that went nowhere. They write about it sometimes. Academic papers, historical analyses, cold case retrospectives. But they can't solve it, because solving requires evidence that doesn't exist anymore. Witnesses who are dead. Documentation that was destroyed or hidden. All they can do is observe. Note patterns. Point out what should have happened but didn't. And then they put the file back. And it sits there, waiting for the next person who thinks maybe they'll be the one to figure it out. But nobody will. Because there's nothing left to figure out. The answer was always clear. It just couldn't be proven, couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be resolved. So it remains. Open, unsolved, unresolved. A case that everyone understood but nobody could close. A murder that was never officially connected to the most obvious suspect. A failure of justice that was so complete, so systematic, so deliberate that it became its own kind of evidence. Evidence of what happens when power matters more than law. When fear is more effective than investigation. When everyone knows the truth, but truth isn't enough. Joseph Aiello was murdered in a Chicago alley in the 1920s. 3 bullets. Close range. Execution style. The investigation stalled almost immediately. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence was lost. The case went nowhere. Everyone knew who was responsible. Everyone knew why it happened. Everyone knew it would never be solved. And they were right. The case file still exists. Open. Unsolved. Buried in a warehouse among thousands of other failures. Nobody works on it anymore. Nobody asks questions. Nobody pushes for answers. Because the answers were always there. They just couldn't be spoken, couldn't be proven, couldn't matter. And that silence, that absence of justice, that systematic failure to prosecute obvious crime, that was the point. That was the real power, Not violence, not intimidation, not even corruption. Just the quiet certainty that some people exist beyond consequence, beyond prosecution, beyond the reach of justice. Al Capone was never charged with killing Joseph Aiello. Not because evidence didn't exist, but because the system was never allowed to use it. And that's how the case was never solved. Not through lack of investigation, but through abundance of power. Power that made evidence disappear. Witnesses silent, files incomplete. Power that everyone saw, but nobody could challenge. Power that turned a clear case into an eternal mystery. Not because the truth was hidden, but because the truth didn't matter, and everyone knew it. The case remains open, unsolved. A permanent reminder of what happens when justice runs into power and loses every time.